All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Everyday Man Profound Conversations. I'm one of your co-hosts, Jonathan Richardson. I'm here today with my fellow co-hosts, MKP brothers, comrades, Brenton Ruger, Adam McConnell, and the man behind the scenes is Ken Emmer. We're representing the Mankind Project of Greater Carolinas. What we are doing is a series of monthly interviews. Monthly interviews covering a wide range of topics centered around radical changes, racial and social injustice, health matters, sexuality, and gender studies. Every interview will feature a guest who specializes in these particular topics. We offer this platform to expand our boundaries and push the envelope for change by bringing awareness to those who may not know, so everyone's voices are heard. This is a joint effort, and it's sponsored by the Mankind Project of Greater Carolinas. It's a chapter of the MKP USA, which is a global organization whose primary focus is on wellness for men. As initiated men, we are responsible for our own well-being and offer support in any way we are capable of for our fellow brothers who are in need. Welcome today, all right? So today we have a very, very deep topic. I have two guests, two powerful women. The topic is what is possible when we focus on our radical interconnectedness through cisgender and transgender lenses. Okay. I just want to introduce my guests. They are women, healers, teachers, alchemists, dear friends to many. We have Drisana McDaniel and Vanity Reed. Welcome. They work together as from the Transformative Teaching Collective, but those are just one of the titles that they have. There's many layers to them, and I would not do much justice by trying to introduce them. So I would just give you a few brief moments to, just talk about who you are, what you do, where your work is, if that's okay with you. Either one can talk first.
I will start us off. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Adam, and to the Mankind Project for inviting me into the space for this conversation. My name is Vanity Deterville. Some of you may see my name in my frame along with my pronouns. I respond to she and her pronouns. Try to normalize that practice in every space that I enter. I am a 27-year-old Black woman of trans experience, born in Charleston, raised in Charleston, South Carolina, trained and educated in political science. I am, for all things, pro-choice, pro-Black, pro-trans, pro-collective liberation and solidarity. I have now relocated to Gold City, the city of medicine, Durham, North Carolina. And since the past July, have been serving as the Gender Resources Advocacy Support Program Director at the LGBTQ Center of Durham, where I have been overseeing the distribution of over $86,000 worth of funds to queer and trans people of color through this pandemic and those who have been affected in some way by the pandemic. I serve as a co-facilitator with the Transformative Teaching Collective with Drew, and I'm happy to dive into this conversation. I think it's necessary. We spoke about that earlier, and I think it'll be fruitful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Drisana Mcdaniel. Drew, you can see if you see my name up there, I also go by Drew. Pronouns are she and her. Vanity and I both work with the Transformative Teaching Collective. I work as a co-facilitator there. In my everyday job, I also work as a race, equity, and justice facilitator for a Black-owned, woman-owned boutique consulting firm. And then I also have my own practice, which is the Alchemy of Now. And the types of things that I do there is I move my research into the living community in conversations like we're having now. I grew up in a military family all over the US, yeah, West Coast, Midwest, the South, even Europe, which is a big part of actually how I realize now is how I've landed in this work, is really having a acute sense of the unique context that the United States is in terms of our racial landscape and cross-racial sort of realities. And I've also studied women and gender studies and sociology in my undergraduate career. I'm actually studying right now, I will always be a student, but I'm studying spirituality, gender, and social justice. So continuing to work in that area, but think really deeply about how we are connected. That is really my biggest curiosity right now is how, what might we do in our connections with each other, in our radical interconnection when we can remember that, and really looking at identity from a different perspective, which we will talk about a little later. But yeah, so I'm really happy to be here. I live in Somerville, South Carolina with my 2 daughters, and I have an adult son that lives in Atlanta.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Yes, definitely an honor to have the both of you here. Joe and I have pretty good friendship, really good friendship. Some of my best conversations I've had with you over the years, and they're all treasured. I value our friendship. So it's, you know, when this opportunity to co-create this platform, you know, I couldn't think of 2 better women to talk with. And Vanity, you and I have never met personally, but I know a handful of people who know of you, and speak of your work very highly. And just the fact that you are in cahoots with Drisana Mcdaniel, you know, it's more than an honor to have you here. So thank you for that. Today we're gonna try to weave some connections between, and hopefully develop some type of understanding between cisgendered and transgender people. And I'm hoping you all can speak on that, because there's there's some of your talking point, Vanity, is centered around the legislative assaults in the trans community, violence of cisgendered men towards transgender women, and root of violence towards trans community. If you don't mind, we can just dive right in on that and just give you all the floor to speak candidly about it.
Certainly. Thank you again. I think in the past several years, and within the past, I think 6 months to last year, especially, transgender issues have made their way to national attention, and our existence has become a hyper politicized topic, simply because we are now and have infiltrated our way into spaces where our community can no longer be hidden. And it frightens those who have held those spaces for the ages past, right? It disturbs whatever status quo and normalcy as we know it. And that is considered dangerous. It's considered infectious. It's considered, it spreads, right? It's invasive. And so we see, because we have a large misunderstanding and ignorance to trans experiences, we see assaults on the community rather than attempts to understand and make equitable decisions for. I'm sure some of you have seen, some of you may not, but in the past year, couple years, the amount of proposed legislation across the states that have either tried to bar trans people from serving in our armed forces, bar trans youth from playing sports, bar trans youth from receiving services up until the age of 18, sometimes 21 or 25, and in more extreme cases, near 30. We see assaults that threaten the very livelihood of folks just trying to be themselves and to find some kind of joy in the life that already oppresses them, right? We see legislation that vilifies a child if they show any sign of gender nonconformity or dressing differently um, and disturbing their workday or their school productivity day. We see so many ways that creates the avenue for a child to be outcasted, and it leads to other coupling issues when it comes to familial rejection, like homelessness and substance abuse and sex work. And so we have to recognize when we talk about interconnectedness, all the immediate concerns that happen after familial rejection from a queer or trans youth. And so, you know, one of the questions we talked about is the root to where some of this tension is stemming from. And it may sound cliche, but a lot of the root does start in the home. And we have got to shift the way we think about parenting and how our children should be raised, the autonomy over their bodies that they are granted and due, and giving them the respect that we expect them to give us. Um, I can't explain to anyone being 6 or 7 years old and voicing to my maternal grandmother that I thought life would be easier living as a woman without having any prior experience to what trans even was, or gay for that matter, which trans is an identity and gay is a sexual preference. I just want to discern between the two. Um, but having had no prior experience, I can never explain how I was able to voice that, to come to the realization as a child. And so knowing that oftentimes children have a more tethered connectedness to their inner self, um, I believe myself. I believe many youth who express themselves. And I think we need to stress the importance of listening to our youth because, you know, even in the Bible, it says from the mouth of babes, you know, and that's supposed to be the purest form of conveying a word is from the mouth of babes. So I don't understand why we can't grant that agency to our youth. So I'll start by saying that I believe that the root does come from the home. Some of the legislation that we've been seeing, I know in North Carolina, we had an Ohio state representative who was able to successfully pass some anti-trans legislation in the state of Ohio, traveled the country in an attempt to pass basically copy and pasted bills in other states, North Carolina being one of the states she attempted to. And one bill in the House, HB 358, two bills in the Senate here in the North Carolina General Assembly, SB 514 and SB 515. All of those pieces of legislation, one, tried to ban trans youth from playing in their sports teams that align with their gender, which we came to find out it's not even significant of a threat, being as there are 9 students maybe in the entire state of North Carolina that this is a topic about. Another gives preference to religious exemption and freedom for providers to discriminate or choose not to provide to someone identifying as queer or trans. And the last one requires any state employee to report any signs of gender nonconformity in a trans youth to their parents, and also bars them from receiving any type of service to affirm either counseling or treatment around their transition until the age of 21. So with that last piece of legislation, I had the hardest contention with because I find it incredibly disrespectful that we have states and a nation that would allow folks to enlist and put their lives on the line for this country before we would allow them to even have access to counseling so that they could feel more secure in themselves to even protect and serve anyone. Also, in requiring a state employee to report to the parents of, that's a form of violence. It's outing someone before they're ready to convey a message. And like I mentioned, I believe it's between 30 and 40% of youth who end up, queer youth who end up homelessness and in homelessness have experienced that type of familial rejection. But you've also created a pipeline, a school to prison pipeline, because every time you see someone embodying anything that doesn't emulate heteronormativity, it's a demerit. You've disrupted their school workday, you've pulled them out of class, you've notified their parents as if you would in the event that they got in a fight and were about to be suspended. So you create a system in which they are punished and penalized for simply being themselves when they could have been on their best behavior. And it forces them from one institution to another. And so I'll just start by laying the foundation to this conversation there.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for all of that. I'd love to mention something that touched me. It's like the increasing coverage of gender identity has really outpaced public understanding. And for many, it seems like that's where the rub is, and just the understanding of what this is. So, I'd like to share with our listeners a little bit about the terminology, because I heard you say about the identity of what, transgender is more of an identity piece, and the other, being gay or is more of a sexual orientation and a preference. And I'd like to offer some insight and some information to our viewers of just what that is, and kind of breaking it down to the bare bones. Like, what is transgender? Because I'm seeing that, more the scientific community is coming around and really showing a lot of evidence that, it is possible for people to be, identify with a different gender than they were assigned at birth. And I think that piece of understanding is really, to me, is really important. I'd love to speak to that, or for you, either of you to speak to that.
Definitely, definitely help lay out what gender versus sexuality is. I think that's how we want to frame that. But I also want to say there is expansive empirical data that shows that folks who are transgender and the functioning of their brain actually aligns more closely with the gender they present with than the sex assigned at birth.
Yeah.
So I just want to present that kind of cool tidbit.
Thank you.
We talk about sexuality, and we talk about orientation in that vein, and the attraction, whether sexually or romantically, to anyone. We talk about gender, we talk about the identity of someone and who they are. It's hard for us to think of that divorce from sexuality because so much about us has been taught through the lens of sex. And this is the presentation that you choose for yourself and to go navigate the world through. For instance, some sexualities may include gay, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, demisexual, aromantic. Those are some types of sexualities that you might find within the community. When it comes to identity, there are many different ways you can think about gender. And so when we think about someone who presents themselves as the sex they were assigned at birth, we refer to that as cisgender. And for someone who aligns differently than the sex they were assigned at birth, we include them into the umbrella term transgender, and transgender has many spring-off sub-communities within that umbrella term. We, sorry, I lost my thought.
When
Okay.
you were saying that, it has many different genders that are under the umbrella of trans, what would you mean, like bigender? Would you?
Exactly. We have an outdated term is transsexual. I think the community has long time been understood as transsexual, but we needed to diverge away from thinking about our identity in terms of our sexuality.
Right.
Now, this is a nuanced instance. This is a term that is still has been reclaimed by some of the community um, for them to use in reference to them. Largely is outdated and not suggested for individuals outside of the community to reference folks in the community, if that makes sense at all.
Mm-hmm.
Also, one way you can identify someone who is trans or gender nonconforming or gender queer, which is a subcategory under transgender, is their sexual assignment at birth. And there are acronyms for that. So in reference to someone assigned male at birth, you would abbreviate AMAB, AMAB. And for someone assigned female at birth, you would denote AFAB, AFAB. So those are different ways that you could also think about someone who is gender expansive and maybe doesn't align with either in terms of how they came into this world and how they now present. Just different ways you can frame it. I mentioned genderqueer, I mentioned gender nonconforming, and I feel like those are the huge subcategories under transgender.
Is there non-binary? Is that another one?
Non-binary is sometimes interchangeably used with genderqueer or nonconforming.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Yes, absolutely. Could you like give us some examples of when you say equitable decisions? Like what does that look like for you when you say that?
Well, I had this conversation yesterday, and it simply was just, an imaginative process. Imagine if everyone who ever held power especially during the influence of colonialism and the North Atlantic slave trade, was replaced by someone who was Black and queer. And the amount of generational trauma and toxicity we would not have to unlearn, and the kind of generational wealth we would have secured, and the disparities that would probably be in our favor instead of against us. And I think this is another approach into Afrofuturist thought. And I believe it was, I want to say Drew and a few other people introduced me to the concept some time ago. And I thought about the fact that queer people in general, trans people, non-conforming people, queer people, if they hold that identity as well as another minoritized social identity, oftentimes they are made to choose between one or the other. And it's a very hard time for those in our primary or our initial community to accept the fact that we also hold this other social identity because it hasn't been the normalcy for that community, right? Remind me of your question.
It was just when you it was it really wasn't a
Oh,
question per
centering.
se.
Sorry, centering. Yeah, centering. Equity comes from centering the experiences of those who have been overlooked. and we think about that graphic that pops up on those stock photos, the difference between equality and equity, when equality is giving everyone the same size or same height stepping stool to view over a fence when they're not the same height. Equity is refocusing and personalizing each step to the height of the person so that everyone has a fair advantage to see over the fence or whatever the obstacle is. And I feel like we can't hand out equal distribution of resources when we haven't been equally adversely affected by things like slavery, by things like colonialism, by things like uh, religion, especially in communities of color, and the impact of that through many generations, especially in the Southern United States, for individuals like myself. Um, Lots more equitable practices would inherently just happen if we had those experiences centered and we had more representation in places of power with these individuals. And I believe that is the root of why we see some of the legislation and the other governmental intimidation towards the trans community is because, like I said, we've now worked very hard to infiltrate these spaces where we weren't welcomed before, and that inching to power is threatening to many folks. And so that's how I feel like equity really happens, is really carried out.
Awesome. Awesome. What you're speaking on brings me to this point I'd like to make, and I personally know that there's likely going to be some heat or some pushback towards me for saying this, and it's okay. But as a cisgender Black-bodied man, a descendant of the African diaspora, one thing I know about us, our indigenous nature, the very core of who we are as a people, therein lies the ability to coexist in our environment, pre-colonial days, just whoever whether there was a disagreement or someone that we agreed with, we all understood that there was an alienable right for us to coexist together in harmony, and there is this popular notion out there within some circles that European colonizers introduced homosexuality to us as Africans. And I know there's studies out there that say opposite, through religious enforcement and things of that nature. It was homophobia that was introduced to us. Is there any, can you kind of speak on that in some way?
I have definitely read and been referenced to the impacts of colonialism on ancient African civilizations specifically, because I like to take it that far back, because I have family from the West Indian Caribbean and the West Indies, and I have seen the kind of influence that colonialism has had there, being as most of the islands are either French or British colonies still to this day. Um, but when you go further back from the West Indies and the slave trade, the influence of colonialism and the introduction of Europeans into ancient African civilizations definitely shifted our perception and our allowance on what Black sexuality and identity could be and should be. There are countless supporting data that refer to trans people in ancient African civilizations and queer people as those sought out after knowledge, those who were respected as healers and shaman, those who were adjudicators, and those who decided grievances. those who commanded in war. You had entire countries led by women who then wifed their husbands. Gender roles were completely flipped from what we understand them to be today. And so after the introduction of European influence, we were taught shame and we were taught to conform, which a lot of religion that I've experienced, both Catholicism and African Methodist Episcopalian, I've seen where the shame came into play into the organized religion of Christianity. And that shame was very deeply ingrained into many of our communities. And that manifested and reflected in some of the most violent ways from generation to generation when it came to what Black sexuality, Black identity specifically could look like.
You have any thoughts on that, Drew?
Oh, I've had lots of thoughts just sitting here and kind of listening. Yeah, so, you know, immediately at the top of my head, without making anything small or minimizing anything, what I want to say is that we've been here in all kinds of ways forever. And so what we're faced with now is how do we act as such? So when we talk about, you know, we really want to explore, like, what is it that oppression is made of? You know, what is it that keeps us doing those things? It's important to understand that, like, what oppression, if we think of oppression, we can understand that there are common elements to oppression. Oppression, the common elements are a norm, right? A defined norm, a standard of rightness, right? And then also often also righteousness, and that those all kind of go together. And those elements are what sort of perpetuate and create, maintain, and perpetuate oppression. Is this idea of norms, this idea of rightness, and this idea of righteousness. And this is what, you know, when we think about, when I think about violence against trans folks, when I think about violence in the context of today, you know, I think about living forward, how we're now at this space where what is driving this violence is this society, these societal norms, these societal standards of rightness, and these societal standards of righteousness, and who is continuing to fight to maintain, to you know, kind of keep their stake in the ground of what norms are and what rightness is and what righteousness is. And that there is a tremendous amount of unlearning in that. But at the center of that unlearning, there must be this focus on what equity looks like. There must be this focus on how am I, by, you know, staking my, by placing my stake in the ground of oppression, by perpetuating these norms and teaching these norms, or legislating around these norms, or feeling entitled to a sense of rightness, right? Or seeking this feeling of righteousness. How am I perpetuating this type of violence? And that is what I think our opportunities are when we think about what is happening with our trans kin and with oppression in general, but definitely with our trans kin, is that so much, there's an incredible amount of, you know, Brenton, you said it, you brought up the word fear. There's this fear at what is not known and understood versus this curiosity, right? And so in that fear, somehow fear takes prevalence over curiosity and humanity and compassion and all of those values that we are constantly wanting to align ourselves with, right? Like compassion, curiosity, love, wholeness, that somehow fear trumps all of that. And really getting into this space of understanding that fear more, and understanding that that fear is often there because we have been taught into these norms. but that these norms, right, are designed for one type of way of being in the world. And everyone outside of those norms are subjected to vulnerability and don't get to be the full magnificent wholeness that they're worthy of. Never mind the processes that made people how they are, because life is complex. And the closer we move to each other, the more we can bear witness to nuance. And okay, that's how, never mind how those turn up. Our job is simply to hold space for that and bear witness to that in our humanity, right? And somehow, and it's not just, I mean, we are really all ensnared in these massive oversystems, right? These overculture, I call these overcultures, where they're like pressing down on us. Oppression presses down on all of us. And really beginning to finally think about, how is oppression pressing down on me as I represent and embody the normative? How am I broken? How am I not whole because of that? And so really beginning to think about what that might mean. You know, what that, never mind the details of difference, just that we're here. And if you're not okay, how am I connected to that? How are you not okay? What is going on? What might I be doing in my world to help further perpetuate your not being okay?
Love it.
Love it, yes. Any questions, Adam?
I had a thought that came out. Thank you for that, Drisana. That was powerful. And thank you, Vanity, as well. There seems to be a recognition that we have a much broader diversity of identity now than we did 50 years ago, when it was seen as a mental illness or something like that, that, you know, you would be like, you know, if you identified as something beside yourself. But I am cis hetero white male, right? So I'm like the establishment to some extent here. But also I'm concerned that like this continual fragmentation of identity into smaller and smaller little groups, although it's important to bear witness to that and to recognize that and to support that, that is not allowing us to act collectively in order to overcome some of these structural oppressive forces that are out there in our culture and society. Do you guys have any insight into how we may take that sort of fractured landscape or fractured humanity back into a more holistic view?
Yeah, I have thoughts on that. Vanity, if you have thoughts, you can go first, but I do have thoughts on that.
I'll allow you to go first.
Okay, so my thoughts on that is, it's a really incredible and very important question. Is that, because one of the things that I think about the work of Anna Louise Keating and Gloria Anzaldúa, who talked about this sort of need to move beyond identity, right? To move beyond these identifiers. And they're not saying to transcend identity, because that's really like, that's a really attractive thought for a lot of folks who are like, I do not want to be affiliated with the establishment. Adam, we could talk about that further too, when you were saying the establishment. Maybe someone who could just snapshot you could see you as such, right? But I suspect, just by the very virtue of us being here, that you're not the establishment, that there's nuance, right? So you might seem to embody that. Now, the thing about transcending identity is it's impossible. I mean, transcending our bodies is impossible. But our attachment to these certain identifiers tends to be the problematic. It's our attachment to these, right? And that is where, and we don't talk about this a lot, because then we have to talk about contemplation, right? Then we have to talk about life being a waking contemplation. Then we've got to talk about the fact that we're constantly becoming and that we're constantly unlearning. But that is really, these are the processes we're constantly a part of. And so when we think about this idea of identity and complexity, first of all, we must recognize that there's going to be tensions we have to hold, and that's why people often back off. We must reckon with the fact that we are infinitely complex, and we are constantly becoming, and that will change always. We must reckon with that. That's a part of what makes people uncomfortable, is we are taught that the way to relate to each other is based on our identity. And this is not to dismiss it, But this is meant to suggest that we are not just our identity, that our identity is a part of who we are, and our identifying all those components of our identity are part of who we are. But when we stop, because it's complex to understand, like, well, but I don't understand. Like, it's because it's complex for us, then that's work we need to do. But we are complex identities, and we are more than our identities. And that tension, I think, is the space to live in. That's why I'm saying we get really caught up in the whole, like, well, I need to understand more about, it's not necessarily. I mean, you need to understand more. You just need to say, I believe you. Oh, I believe you. Oh, I believe you. And that's the place to be, as opposed to the analysis space. That's the place to live. That's the open-hearted space to live from, right? As opposed to the analysis space, which keeps us up right up in here. I need to know more. I just need to know more about this first, and then I can make some decisions. Nope. Are you human? You know, that's it. Let me love you, and let me figure out what that must look like. And let me figure out, you know, what that looks like as an action. And I think when we live in those kinds of ways, we experience our lives as a recovery, because we are unlearning. And it's all, I mean, I love this idea of like Richard Rohr, one of my favorites, this construction. I like the idea of the deconstruction and then the reconstruction. And the reconstruction is where a lot of us are, you know, at this point in our lives, I think, at least for me being, you know, in my 40s. You know, it's so you get these rules, you get these structures. A lot of them are bullshit, but you get them and they keep you alive, and they get you to that middle place where you start just tearing it all down. That's where my son is, you know, 20s. Just tear it all apart, deconstruct it. What? That was BS, that was BS, that was BS. And it's not linear, by the way, it's not linear either. And then we get to that place where we start reconstructing, when we start creating a story, a narrative that is life-giving. We start having new relationships. We start experiencing liberation, right? We become committed to that liberation, but it's a part of that process. And at the same time, in all of that, it's the same way with this identity. It's the same way with all, there's so much for us to unlearn about how we were told we were. It was never that simple. We were just taught it was that simple because that was a part of the construction. Like, let me keep you alive. You need to know this so you can do this. And then we get in this deconstruction phase and things get really like, I find it to be like, people in deconstruction don't care. Like my son, he's like, doesn't care. Forget it, it's a lie, it's a lie, it's a lie, it's a lie. But we get in reconstruction, and that's where things get a little more uncomfortable. We have to really begin to build some capacity to grapple with complexity. How is it that I was taught this, and what do I need this any longer, or how might I change this? How might I integrate with this in a way that creates wholeness for me, as opposed to keeps me kind of bound by rules and performing, as opposed to really living, you know, open and living from the truth of who we really want to be, who we really want, our yearnings, how we chase our yearnings. And that's that reconstruction phase. And I'm sorry if it sounds too abstract, or I know I can get real, but that is really, I mean, you know, that is really it in my personal perception.
I want to echo what you said about the process not being linear. I find myself at 27 right now, and going into 4 years into my journey as a transgender woman. I find myself teeter-tottering back and forth between deconstruction and reconstruction. And I think the reconstruction, the inception of my transition happened before a lot of the deconstruction, just because I was fed up. So that started a few years ago. And in my reconstructing, I recognized that I still needed things gone and unlearned. And I'm dealing with those things on and off. I'm a growing young adult in this world during a pandemic. And it's been an interesting journey. I wanted to also echo the sentiment about the way we've been taught to communicate and find solace and who we have an affinity towards. And also beg the question as to who were the people who designed the classes that we fit ourselves into. What were the words, the original words and phrases that they used to categorize us? What did those words denote? What regions did we come from? What negatively connotative meanings came from those classifications? We got to really think about the inception of how we began to categorize ourselves and realize that all these subcategories are just us adapting to a system, another institution that was designed to not only classify but oppress us. And now we have identities building on identities. And it's not that these individuals are just now here. It's now that using a system that was used to discredit and devalue us, we are now finding the nuances within that same classification system to provide the language for who we are finally.
And I just want to say yes, yes, yes. And I just want to say that if we have anything to learn from the people that are doing that, we are learning what it means to actually live as if liberation matters. That is what we are learning. And people that are scratching their heads off and are like, but how can you just do that? And what does that mean? What might that cost me? Right? And so this is where I mean, we really, really need to stay, look at deconstructing that when those come up. Why am I feeling like this is doing something to who I am? Well, it is. It is. It's giving you an opportunity to reckon with what you were taught and to decide for yourself what the truth might be. Because maybe if we're scratching our heads, we're seeking liberation too, right? And so I'm inspired by the fact that there are new ways to come out and say, here is who I am becoming, because there is liberation in that. What I'm not okay with is the fact that there are forces who still think it's okay to harm folks for insisting on their liberation.
Mm-hmm. And I think that speaks to that over-attachment to the identity that people, it's like less about the attachment, it's the over-attachment. And we could have a whole conversation about identity and how that's formed in the ego and how people orient themselves to safety in their little bubble and how much of a disservice that actually does to them. In the world that I study in, it's dying to an identity over and over. And that's why I raise my hands. Like, I can feel you. Like, in the past 8 years, I don't know how many of me just died away painfully, kicking and screaming, so that I could see the world as I truly and deeply wanted. Because there's that balance, Adam. It's like, I am responsible to myself for the experience I want to be having. So I go from, there's a balance of being in my victim and being in my empowered space. So I think it's a conversation where a lot of people are like, they don't understand what other people have been through and what they go through. And like, oh, come on, just rise up and get out of that. And it's not about that. It's about, like Drew said, what choices can I make to really serve this individual and serve people so that we can, really get over this moral superiority that people have, and that right way belief in our country is so powerful, that there's a right way to do it. There's a right way to live. And that's really my mission. And I think part of this conversation as we're getting closer to the end is just breaking down those concepts and allowing people to see how much effort it takes for them to uphold those walls and those barriers that were probably given to them between the ages of 1 and 6 years old.
There we go.
That's
I just lift that up. Brandon, I lift that up. I want to share a quote from Sherry Mitchell. She says, the myth of separation is at the heart of the lies we've been fed, and it supports all of the power structures that we have created. I mean, it's a myth. It's a myth. It's a story. It's a story. It's a story. I just lift that up. It's not based in reality whatsoever that we live in.
That story does have a very, very strong influence on our culture. And so I see, like, you have this individual liberation, I guess we'll call it, right, of like the self. But how does that translate into societal change? I mean, what's the model of social change look like where that takes that into account and is able to gain enough?
Yeah. So I think the problem is the idea of the individual. It's not what Brenton is talking about and what I've been talking about in terms of this work and this individual opportunity to deconstruct and reconstruct, that it is this individual piece, but it's also recognizing that we're not individual. Like that's the other part. It's how we then, how all of that, the individual work must and should, and I don't know how it wouldn't, translate to collective work. But the collective work is this work here, you know, and the work that grows, right, as people start creating these sort of cohorts where they can heal together, these cohorts where they can begin to take action together, right? And what happens is there's not a model for it, because it's only in our own individual waking up that we begin to imagine possibilities that we can create together. There's not necessarily a model. There isn't a model. That's why we're still doing this work.
Mm-hmm.
It's what can we, this is what I say when I say what's possible together. What can we create together? And that comes from imagining possibilities. And that comes from getting close to each other. And that comes from aha moments in our waking contemplations. And that comes from making decisions and creating events and pulling together, you know, funding projects. And, you know, what is someone not eating well? Is someone at risk? This is what I mean. But the individual connects to the connective. The problem is a lot of folks get stuck in the individual. You can do that forever. I mean, there are therapists who will talk to you for 30 years about your stuff, you know? So it's like, you know what I mean? So how are we going to do anything? How do we do anything about it? So it's not that we're just back to the individual, because that's a myth.
Self-importance.
I wanna, that notion of individualism in this world, being Black and trans and working in sustainability provided me a very different outlook on our consumption, the way we move through this world, the impacts of our consumption, the impacts of our brothers and sisters and siblings in different nations from our consumption, the impact on the planet, what that means for our most overlooked communities, what those effects have on those communities. I think that we need to really understand just how small of a moment in time each and every one of us individually is in the grand scheme of this universe, and recognize that the true progress comes from mobilization, because we are such small moments in time. When it comes to climate change, and this may be a little off topic, we recognize that the only way we can curb these effects is if we are all on board with changing our consumption rates, the way we produce, the way we ship, the way we travel. It has to be a mass mobilization to curb the effects of climate change, which have been said to affect coastal communities adversely, disproportionately, which we have seen in areas like Charleston, where communities of color have been purposely zoned and districted on these coastal communities and areas that are very prone to flooding and undesirable weather conditions. And that interconnectedness, and seeing that even though you're such a small moment in time, but that your actions coupled with the actions of every other small moment in time around you provide grave consequences. And so the same goes for language and checking violence in spaces, and the knowledge and the ideals that we bring up and teach in our homes. We may think that we're one family, one nuclear unit, one household, but the proximity that we have in our individuality to others is infectious. And I just want us to think about it in like that framework. Curbing the adverse effects of these things mean striking down the individuality and heightening the mobilization.
Beautiful.
Absolutely.
Beautiful. I know our time is winding down, but I just want to share a takeaway from this. You know, I'm now establishing a connection between our interdependency and interconnectedness, if that makes sense. I mean, it's starting to make sense to me, because both of those practices are just they're similar, but they run a parallel path. And just creating threads, creating bridges between those two for me is what I would love to see for myself. And does anyone have any like closing, want to end this with some closing thoughts and things that would take away see for myself? And does anyone have any like closing, want to end this with some closing thoughts and things that take away from here?
I have something in response to what you said, in response to what Vanity said, in response to what I was saying before. So when we live as if we know these things, okay, when we live as if we know something new now, it's really important to not fall prone to inaction because what it is that you're thinking to do isn't big enough. It's really important to understand that what you take from this becomes your contemplation, and that you begin to walk forward with new eyes to notice opportunities to act for meaningful change. And so, because people get stuck in that, like, well, what kind of project do we need to start? And I promise you, right under your nose, among your own people you may deal with, 5 people you may deal with, the most, there's an opportunity to begin to spark change through just our conversations. Because this is, if we really were to think about the beauty of being made as we are individually, intentionally created as we are, with our nuance and our differences, what I always think about is the fact that however I came into this world, that my gifts are my gifts. And I'm going to know what I can do with my gifts if I stay awake, if I stay looking, if I stay working, if I stay up in that transformation space. And so that can be seriously in the middle of the night, we need to have this event, we need to have this talk. Or that could be, I need to have this conversation so that we talk about this mission for this organization and get to change it. So that to think about where are you spending your time? Where might your sphere of influence live? And how might you begin to create change there, as opposed to, I've got to create the change out here. That's how organizing happens. That's how we make momentum. That's the way it works. Not, I just don't know what to do now. It's that. I just wanted to share that, because that is how this works. That is how the change happens. So that's my parting share.
Thank you for that, Drew. I don't think mine will be as it's sweet. I've tried to make things sound a little eloquent up until this point, but I feel like these conversations and these topics always sound great in theory, but actualized is always the hardest, right? And so the true test for me and someone championing this effort or harnessing this unlearning and reconstructing within themselves or for their family, the true test to that is if it comes to your children, your child in your household, what will you do? And I'll just leave on that note.
Boom.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. That's wonderful.
That's on point. Very on point. Anybody else?
I think those 2 comments speak for themselves.
I have pages of notes, and I'm going to rewatch this about 14 times before I understand all of it. So I really appreciate all the input.
Yeah. And really grateful.
Into this.
Yeah, very touched.
I sure appreciate the work y'all are doing.
Oh yeah.
So well.
I do. I want to also, it's not very often these conversations are welcomed by cisgender men, in my experience. And so to see that, which is why I wanted to assure you, Jonathan, especially before we started, you having already welcomed this into the space is what needed to happen. We're on a trajectory. These conversations have to keep happening though.
Yes.
But it was needed. It was crucial.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, I'm going to shut up after this, but I am I remain hopeful. I remain hopeful because fortunately my work lands me in a place where I get to have these conversations now with folks who, you know, I couldn't have imagined before. I didn't doubt it, but at the same time, like when I'm having it, I'm like, yes, yes, we're alive at this time, in this moment. Yes, yes, this is the hope of action. Yes, yes, we can do something. And so I can't thank you enough for being here and being willing just to open this up and approach it with an open heart. Keeps me in the work. It keeps me in the work. So thank you, y'all.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I realize saving the world starts with taking a good, hard look in the mirror. And when I do that, I become more confident in the being that I am. I'm not willing to edit how I feel and how I show up in the world. So, you know, that's what I invite our listeners. If there's resistance, look at that resistance within oneself. See what that's all about, how much energy it takes to maintain that wall or that resistance, and making it, because I love what you say, because transformation and change can begin with the very basics, just the most simple things. And it really, for me, it starts with the look in the mirror. So I'm grateful for this conversation this morning. A lot of places I get to look in the mirror this afternoon and moving forward. So thank you. Right.
Okay. Well, that's it. That says it all in a nutshell for now. We just want to thank you all for listening. Thank you all for joining. This thread, you can feel free to comment on. We will reply as we see fit. Thank you for tuning in, everyone. And until next time, peace and blessings to you all.
Thank you.
Amen.